Do the hard thing, not the easy thing. Do the hard thing, not the easy thing. So now we're at the place where we're going to talk to the funders and one lawyer. Resilience in Action, Supporting DEI and Journalism Amid Policy Shifts. This session offers a thoughtful exploration on how to navigate a shifting policy landscape under this new administration, marked by intensified scrutiny and challenges to DEI principles and journalistic integrity. We will dive into strategies to bolster resilience and foster self-care for grantees while examining ways to uplift marginalized voices in an increasingly polarized environment. What proactive roles can funders play in safeguarding journalism's integrity and championing equitable practices during these critical times? Join us now for a collaborative discussion to reflect on our shared responsibilities, exchange actionable insights, and strengthen our networks. Together, we will identify pathways to protect and empower our grantees, sustain transformative work, and reinforce the ecosystems that drive positive change. The speakers: Nuala Cabral, Program Officer of Independence Public Media Foundation, otherwise known as IPMF. Come on up to the stage, please. Shawn, Head of Philadelphia Programs, the Lenfest Institute for Journalism. Tracy Powell, founder of the Pivot Fund. Maya Raghu is the National Director of Protecting and Advancing Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Initiative, Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights under the Law. Guess who's having the conversation with them? Hey, here we go. Good afternoon to all of you. I don't know if this is on. Can someone push? If you read, Andre, it will all work out. All right, let's see. So before we began this discussion, we all had a meeting, and we had some frank conversation about what is needed in this media landscape that we now find ourselves in. And I spoke openly and transparently to all of you about the fear that many in media feels right now, right? About speaking up, about using their voices, what does that mean? And Tracy said something that made me shiver. So we'll talk about that in a little bit. But this conversation is going to be open mostly to all of you. I'm asking them all one question, and so prepare your questions about what you need to do moving forward. Shawn, coming from a social justice background, you have emphasized that supporting diversity, equity, and inclusion in journalism is a must and requires funders to stay the course despite the current policy shifts and pressures. Given the challenging climate, what specific strategies and approaches are essential for funders, not just to sustain their support for DEI efforts, but also to effectively empower and guide their grantees to continue this vital work for both marginalized communities and the broader public? And as a grantor, do you feel the pressure about continuing to support DEI work?
Thank you. So yes, I think that it is, one of the things that I've done, in my role since joining the Lenfest Institute is we've always kind of looked at the broader landscape, right? So we do a landscape analysis to understand what the needs are. One of the things that's consistently come back in Philadelphia is the need for a more diverse media ecosystem in terms of ownership, in terms of minority leadership in the organizations. Folks don't necessarily always see themselves represented in the stories that are coming back or in the leadership of the media organizations. And so we have built a cadre of programming that supports that helps to train, helps to prepare folks. And I think it's not about and that's what kind of frustrates me, the whole argument of DI and whether or not it's racist. No, if you're leveling the playing field and you're creating space that allows people to represent their communities in the ways that that community reflects back in a mirror, then you're not putting anyone at a disadvantage, right? You're doing the job that is necessary. And I think as funders, we need to continue to do the job that is necessary in our communities. And so I think that is an imperative, right? And that's something that we need to continue to be focused and true and honest about.
I have a follow-up question for you. When people tell you that DEI, focusing on DEI is racist, what is the response from Lenfest, the Lenfest Foundation about that?
Well, as I look at Jim, I don't necessarily speak for the organization, but I would say that, we have not shied away from our commitments.
Okay.
And so we, again, are recognizing and responding to the needs of our community.
Okay, thank you, fair enough. Tracy, welcome. Based on your work supporting news organizations, you have observed firsthand some significant challenges grantees are facing right now, including incidents of surveillance and substantial losses in advertising revenue. What are the most urgent and critical needs you are currently seeing among journalism grantees in this environment, particularly concerning their safety, security, and financial sustainability? And how are funders or the broader journalism ecosystem responding to these crises?
First, thank you. Thank you to Jim and Shawn and Roshni for having me here, inviting me to Philly to have this really, really important conversation with all of you. And thank you all who stayed for this important conversation. We're seeing among independent newsrooms, particularly newsrooms led by folks who serve communities of color, under increasing threat. I'm just going to put it out there. They were already facing significant challenges because these organizations tend to be under-resourced, even now, after all that we know and understand about the problems that are happening and developing in this country, even after Haitian immigrants in Ohio were threatened. Now what we're seeing, Pivot Fund, we anticipated some of this post-election, and we started planning, right? We started holding security webinars for publishers, and we started talking about how do you keep your community members safe at events that you might sponsor, and we talked about how to keep your newsroom safe and your staff safe. What we did not anticipate is how quickly things would happen this year. And so some of the things that Pivot has seen with its grantees and publisher community, in Minnesota, Black Press led by Georgia Fort immediately saw $250,000 wiped away overnight when Target decided to cancel their advertising contract. $250,000 would shut down any small newsroom. Fortunately, a local funder there, the McKnight Foundation, stepped up and replaced that $250,000. But just imagine, right, what that cost her in terms of growth. She was able to maintain the status quo, but she can't grow when things like that happen. But it let her know, and I think it let us know, that some folks don't invest for the right reasons, right? When it's a check mark, that's not a good reason to give an organization money. We also saw a similar thing happen with our grantee in West Virginia, Black by God. They lost a huge advertising contract because of anti-DEI sentiment. Now let's go on the other side with our Latino brothers and sisters and our grantees. In Savannah, Georgia, we have a grantee that was surveilled and followed by ICE and the Georgia State Patrol. Not because she is an undocumented immigrant, but because she has family members who are. And she also serves a community that is largely undocumented. And so through her, a publisher who is a go-to source of not just information, but support, following her will lead them to the people that they really want to try to capture. We've also had, people come to us and talk to us about being surveilled, receiving threats, receiving threatening email. There's an increased incidence of this, right? And now you have the raids happening, which I believe is escalated by outside forces, not just in LA, but now happening across the country. It was already happening in Arizona with one of our grantee partners. And so, you know, with the raids, reporters, freelancers, publishers are being pepper sprayed. They're being targeted because remember, they're controlling the message to their community members, right? They're putting information out there that some folks don't want to see disseminated to those communities. And so they are being targeted and some of them are being accused of obstruction, right? And so I think that those are the kinds of challenges that as a funder, I had not anticipated. Most funders just write a check and then they move on. But what I think is needed in this moment is for philanthropy to step up and recognize, yes, the pro bono legal support is critical, and I'm glad a lot of funders are doing that now. But we also need to add security. You might, as a funder, find yourself having to pay for security for a news outlet now, right? And that can be expensive. I remember there was one organization that even they requested security dollars to support their newsroom and to keep their people safe. So we might, as funders, ask ourselves, are we now in the security furnishing business? The answer might be surprising. And I also think, you know, in this moment, rapid response dollars are critical. People are now, they're out there covering protests, just like we were covering protests following Floyd's murder. Folks are out there covering protests. They need PPE. They need not just give them a lawyer's phone number. The lawyer needs to be on speed dial, right? So they can, before they go out there and cover the protests, the lawyer needs to be on speed dial to know that if anything happens to this publisher or this reporter, they need to get out there immediately. And so there's just a lot right now that I think, a lot of pressures that founders and publishers are under, their community members are panicked. You know, in Savannah again, and I'm gonna pass it in just a second. In Savannah again, I mean, a large chunk of her revenue is event-based, right? And so vendors were paying her up, $600,000 to go to a Dia de los Muertos event, right? That's almost her entire revenue for the year. And now they may not be able to have it because Hispanic immigrants in particular cannot gather en masse. They just can't. And so, these are the things. Revenue is at risk, but more importantly, bodies are at risk.
Thank you so much for that. Nuala, IPMF has publicly committed to maintaining its strategy around supporting DEI and recently approved significant emergency funding for key partners facing threats. How is IPMF prioritizing and deploying this emergency support and related initiatives to directly address the specific safety, legal, financial, and wellness challenges that grantees are experiencing, especially those serving vulnerable communities or dealing with traumatic events?
Is this on? Okay.
Yes.
Thank you for that. And thank you for having me. Very moved by what you're sharing, and thank you for underscoring that bodies are on the line.
Yes.
This is a really intense moment, and it's sitting with us differently, perhaps due to the different ways we might be connected to these challenges. For some of us, it's very personal, and then we're also watching a genocide unfold on our phones. So this is a heavy moment, and this is a moment where we need as much accurate information as possible. And so funders who support news and journalism and media, this is not a time to shy away. This is a time to lean in. And to really, for IPMF, it's also about really leaning into support those communities who are most at risk right now and who are most vulnerable. We have grantee partners who are not able to pay their staff right now. Staff members working with no pay for months because federal grants have been cut or DEI rollbacks have happened. And so we are prioritizing those organizations right now. Many small grassroots organizations, many of them are fiscally sponsored projects. Thankfully, last year, our board, when the election happened, we kind of had an emergency meeting, and we decided to reach out to our key partners. We have about 56 key partners in the region, and we asked them, tell us, what are your concerns right now? What are you anticipating? And we know that this is a moment of uncertainty, but what are your fears? And how might we be able to support? And we gathered that information, and then we went to our board and we said, here's a list of the things that our key partners are concerned about. Some of them are concerned about threats, are concerned about digital security, are concerned about the legal battles that they might be facing. And a lot of those fears, of course, have come true and even escalated beyond what some of us could have even imagined back in from last November. And so we went to our board and we said, we feel a need to step in this moment, and we want to be able to be responsive and swift, right, and flexible, and meet our key partners where they are. And so our board approved $2.5 million to make available for the next 2 years up into the midterms, with the understanding that key partners are going to need support beyond the regular grants that they have. And so with that $2.5 million, what is that going towards? A lot of it is emergency grants for organizations who have lost funding. It's also going towards capacity building support. Legal and digital security support is a need, but also just like financial management and strategic planning, that kind of support is also needed. And so we have funds available for those two things. We also heard from our grantees that they're looking to connect, to convene with each other across, whether it's the journalism grantees want to be able to talk to each other, whether it's organizations that are focused on certain areas or certain audiences. Folks need to get together and be able to share resources, to share ideas, to share support. And so we have funding available too to allow to try to motivate grantees to organizations to gather and to have shared space. So those are kind of the three areas that our board also allowed gave staff the authority to make those grant decisions so that we can be swift and responsive and flexible. However, there's also a portion of that $2.5 million that's going to be dedicated towards strategic investments in infrastructure and creative ideas that grantees might have that can really just strengthen the network when it comes to information gathering and sharing. And so we're the application that we put out is very simple. It's, I think, 2 questions. Mm-hmm. What do you need? How do you plan to spend these funds? There's no grant report. Mm-hmm. We're hoping
You're
that
making it super easy at this
yes.
point. Yes.
Yeah,
That's awesome, Nuala.
Why are we going to create a burdensome process? I mean, so many organizations are struggling. Mm-hmm. We don't need to tell us in 10 ways how and why they need the support. Just give us a few sentences and we will respond how we can. Now, I don't want to overstate that, this $2.5 million might sound like a lot of money. It is significant, but we have 56 key partners. And so spreading that out and trying to also make that available to folks, but also identifying okay, there are some organizations that need to be more prioritized. Right. We have organizations that are serving undocumented communities, that are serving gender expansive folks. These are people who we know are under attack right now. Mm-hmm. And so yeah, we're trying to respond as best we can in this moment, and it's really, it's wonderful to be on stage with other funders who are also just trying to do our best and be responsive and make life easier for folks and not harder in this moment of struggle.
I'm coming to you, Maya, because we need the lawyer's perspective, right? We talked about what this means for many of us, but for those of you who are funders, all three of you, is there any level of anxiety or fear that you feel in this moment as funders to these organizations while you watch them lose funding, while you watch them fear for their lives and for their employees, et cetera? Is there any level of anxiety that any of the three of you feel in this moment, seeing what's on the table?
Of course. I mean, yeah, I was on the phone with the publisher of Afro LA yesterday. I had to call because I needed to know what does she need in that moment, right? How is her staff doing? How is she doing, right? What do I need to do? What do you need from me right now? And if I need to pick up the phone, I don't have unlimited resources. So if I don't have it, can I pick up the phone and call another funder and say, hey, can we co-fund this together, right? And so, yeah, I think we feel pressure, I think, but it's nowhere near the kind of pressure that they're facing.
Yeah, I mean, I would definitely second that, and and I think that is the greatest fear, right? Even as funders, and we've have significant endowments or what have you, and I've worked at it's not enough money to meet the need, and I feel definitely grateful. Nuala and I have combined and co-funded several both emergency funding, planned programming and funding. And so to have that notion of collaboration that you spoke of earlier, just even around the programming is even more important among funders because, we can't do it alone. We can't meet the extreme need, and that need is now, multiplied given the environment that we're in. And so, I think there's anxiety around that, but then we also have to be brave, right? And we can't fold in light of the pressure because there is a need out there that will not be met, right? And we can do our part collectively to do our best to try and address it.
Thank you, Nuala.
I'm also mindful of the ways in which so many of our grantees are just being so thoughtful. They're dealing with the stress, and then they're also being so thoughtful. I'm thinking about a handful of our grantees who are lifting up stories of undocumented folks right now with the understanding that the way that they tell these stories matters. They got to try to keep people safe. And so we have youth media organizations we support. We have journalism organizations, community radio stations that are trying to find ways to lift up these stories and get information out. And the way that they do that is incredibly important. And that's why I think also we need to talk to lawyers and bring lawyers into these spaces so that, that folks don't do harm. Although that's not their intention, there's a lot of care that needs to come into this work of storytelling.
Agreed. Maya, I think we brought you in after we began having a little discussion about what does this mean around our safety. The conversation has highlighted the challenging environment news organizations are operating in, focusing specifically on advancing equity within journalism. From a legal perspective, what are some of the key considerations and best practices that newsrooms and funders should be aware of to ensure their efforts to build are effective and fully more compliant with relevant laws in the current landscape? Now, Maya, the laws are changing every 2 seconds. So what advice do you have for people to stay focused without losing their minds?
Yeah, well, thank you for having me here. Your question has a lot of different parts, so my answer is going to have a lot of different parts. I want to go back to what we started talking about on this panel, and talk a little bit about what diversity, equity, and inclusion is and isn't, because in this current environment, there is so much misinformation and misunderstanding that is driving a lot of panicked behavior, whether it's by institutions or by the organizations that are against diversity, equity, and inclusion, and they're trading on that fear and intimidation and misinformation. I want to highlight some lawful efforts that funders can undertake to support underserved communities in this moment, many of which are modeled by the amazing funders on this panel. And then also efforts by newsrooms to diversify their hiring and creating more equitable, inclusive workplaces, because that's how you are going to better be able to find and report on the stories and the communities in this city. Unless your staff is reflective of those communities, like, there's not going to be that trust. Just say a few things about diversity, equity, inclusion. The law is the law is not constantly changing. What is changing is this sort of nonstop barrage of executive orders from this administration, lawsuits from private organizations that are trying to extinguish diversity, equity, inclusion efforts, intimidation by the administration, trying to deter private entities from engaging in these efforts. Diversity is not illegal, equity is not illegal, inclusion is not illegal, and there's no case that says they are per se illegal, right? In fact, these efforts can help you stay on the right side of the law, to comply with all the anti-discrimination laws in this country that are protecting vulnerable populations, whether it's in the workplace, in housing, in education, every one of which is under attack today. Diversity, equity, inclusion efforts are not racial preferences. They are not quotas. Done right, they actually are all about, as you said, creating a level playing field. It is identifying and removing unfair barriers that keep people from having a fair shot, right? And it benefits everyone. And they are really essential for growth and resiliency as a country. Now, if you are a funder in this environment, obviously if you are receiving federal funds, those are under attack right now, and we're seeing that happen across sectors. Grants being terminated, terms modified, like unilaterally without any sort of opportunity to engage or appeal. However, the administration's actions have not changed the legal landscape when it comes to private giving. If you are a funder that is giving private funds, if you're an organization receiving private funds, no federal money, the administration's actions haven't changed. There is a lot you can still do. Obviously, the risk of scrutiny of what you're doing has increased. And so I want to commend all of you for not only just standing firm, but for leaning in to your giving and recognizing what is happening in this moment and what nonprofits need. But it is a really good moment, that being said, for everyone to take a hard look and review your programs and make sure that you are on the right side of the law. It is also an opportunity to evaluate your risk tolerance, right? There's a lot of people who are rightly scared, but have a commitment to do this work and don't want to change that. Part of my job at Lawyers Committee is I run an initiative that provides strategic legal advice to nonprofit organizations across the country, small, grassroots, community-based organizations whose mission is racial equity, serving underserved communities. And our job is to provide them with legal advice about how they can continue to do that work safely in this environment. But part of my job is also creating a safe space, a community for people to come together, to receive accurate advice, to learn from each other, to build solidarity, which is what we all need in this moment. So let me just say a couple of things. Because of some recent court cases, using race as an explicit criteria for your grants is more risky now. Race can be a factor, And a lot of it depends on whether your grants are structured, are going to be seen as a contract or really a grant. And one way to address this now is something that you all are modeling is, what people call trust-based philanthropy. It's just giving the grant without a grant agreement, without a lot of terms and conditions. It allows your grantees to have the flexibility and the resources they need to meet this constantly changing legal environment and the very real threats that they're facing. Another way to do this work is, and I'm going to use the words of some experts at NYU Law School, is to move from cohorts to content. So instead of focusing, say, scholarship programs or fellowships, sort of explicitly race-based or explicitly for Native American women, what you can do as part of your criteria for those programs is think about, well, ask these applicants, what is your demonstrated commitment to advocacy on behalf of the Black community, on behalf of folks who are re-entering, on behalf of Latinas? Ask applicants to talk about their lived experience in those communities. What is their experience working on their behalf? You can also increase your recruitment and outreach efforts to ensure that there are more underrepresented or underserved populations in whatever program that you are granting for. The final sort of part that I'll talk about is from the perspective of newsrooms as employers. You want to diversify your newsrooms. How do you go about doing that in this environment that we're in? Proactive efforts are still lawful under our civil rights laws, despite what you might hear from this administration. Some things you can do similarly to funders is to expand your recruitment and outreach. If you keep going back to the same elite schools or the same sources of recruitment, word of mouth hiring, you're just drawing from that same pool. You're missing out on all kinds of talent. Similarly, I would really urge you, if you haven't already, take a really hard look at your job descriptions if you haven't done that in a while. Is a 4-year degree really required for the jobs that you're hiring for? Or are you really more interested in people's skills and experience? Because then you will widen the circle of people who have the talent, the lived experiences that you need for the communities you want to serve. Diversity, equity, inclusion isn't just about race, despite all the focus and conversation about it. It's for people with disabilities. It's for people who are re-entering. It's for women, LGBTQ people. It's across all kinds of dimensions, and so if you think more broadly, that will help you stay on the right side of the law as well. Just say 2 other things. It's still lawful to have employee resource groups as long as they are open to all people. You can still have an LGBTQ affinity group as long as allies, people who agree with the objectives of the group, are allowed to be there. And finally, this is controversial right now, but it shouldn't. Data collection and analysis of your applicants and of your workforce can really help you identify problems and fix them before it's too late. And that is also a diversity, equity, and inclusion tool. All of these things can help you keep doing the important work that you're doing and keep you safe in this environment. Maybe we can talk about this in the Q&A part, but I have a whole list of other issues that nonprofits need to be thinking about in this moment to protect themselves, because I think we can expect the attacks on nonprofits as a sector of civil society to ramp up strongly very, very soon.
Thank you so much. We have time now. Thank you. We have time now to take some thoughtful questions, because just before you guys came on the panel, I was having a similar conversation here. There's a lot happening. I feel the fear of folks, and just really want them to be aware that we need to collaborate more than anything else if we're going to move forward, because these silos that we're in are just not going to work. So to hear you talk about this, Nuala, about people wanting to figure out to collaborate, to hear Shawn saying we're going to keep doing this, and to hear Tracy going, well, I feel the fear, but we have to keep moving forward. This is going to distinguish the the titans from the, oh, okay, I think I'm over this because I'm afraid of my life. And history has already shown that this is what happens, right? Not everybody's going to show up and do this stuff. So who has a question?
I do.
Go ahead, Denise.
I guess my question is, and this is kind of directed to those of you who are in the fundraising space, what are you hearing from the people from whom you solicit funds? Especially, Tracy, since your work centers on BIPOC media in the South and Midwest. What are you hearing from people when you go to them and say, okay, I'm trying to raise these funds so I can do like nonprofit stuff or stuff for grassroots organizations or stuff for journalism organizations? What are you hearing from funders? Are they afraid to give you money?
Thank you. This is a really important question, and I'm going to answer it in a couple of ways. First of all, the Pivot Fund, because we are so outspoken about funders and about philanthropy, we already have some challenges, right? Because we are outspoken, and I'm going to speak out today too. And so, but the good thing is we have not seen a change in the dollars that we raise. Most funders say they remain committed to the work that we do, and they find the work that we do really compelling. That said, we have had to expand how we describe our work. We now support communities that are underserved and under-resourced instead of just BIPOC communities. We support urban and rural communities. And as you know, Black and brown folks exist in both of those, right? So we were not in violation of anything. When I launched the Pivot Fund, I took steps then to make sure, because I saw this stuff coming down the pipe. And so I wanted to, we have not had to change the work that we do, but we have had to change the way we describe it a little bit, just a little bit. A lot of funders say, or they were saying, we are taking a beat to understand what's happening, right? We want to understand how we should be responding in this moment. And we also hear that we need to give more dollars to essential services. Essential services. Unfortunately, and I would love to hear from my fellow panelists, journalism, civic news and information is not always looked upon as essential services. And I think we need to change that. And so, yes, there are more people who are going hungry now, so they need food. I fully support that. Yes, there are young people who may or may not be able to go to colleges because of admission changes, so we need to support more of that. Yes, we need to make sure we are housing the unhoused, but unless and until those folks have critical news and information, those problems will persist, and that needs to be communicated by the funding community to everybody so they understand exactly what's at stake, right? And I hope I'm answering your question. If I'm not, please let me know. But these are the kinds of things that we are hearing and that we need. I think philanthropy needs to do a better job of addressing and helping people understand the role that critical news and information plays in what's happening in the overall ecosystem.
Ooh, we're in a pickle. Anyone else? Go ahead,
Yes.
Joss.
Hi, lovely funders, two of which are our funders. I have a question about how do you serve folks who are navigating these times and kind of staying ahead of a crisis? I mean, as most of you know, we kind of hit a point and, got ahead of some things. And sometimes I feel like we're being penalized for that. I think there's a great effort to support the under-resourced and the people who hit the crisis and the people who can't pay their staff. But if you do the forecasting and you make the decisions and have the talks with the board and try to approach things responsibly, then people say, oh, they're okay. I talked with a funder who said, you guys always look like you're doing well. We want to grant people who are like out of money or who don't have anything. And I feel sometimes that the desire to serve the most under-resourced, the most broken, sometimes it feels like there's a penalty for being strategic, for communicating in advance, and for making decisions to actually sustain so that you don't die in this thing. So as funders, I mean, like, do you reward those who are getting ahead of things? Like, do you take that into consideration, or like, how does that play into your funding formula? Because I will say that I think for organizations like mine, when I'm doing well, everyone in my circle is doing well because I believe in equity. So that means that my writers are being paid fairly. That means that my contractors are being paid equitably. So it's not just about the organization having a large budget. It's about how we're impacting our ecosystem. Thank you, ecosystem. Yes, thank you.
Who wants to tackle that?
I mean, I'll start by saying, you know, I think part of the issue is, you know, what we addressed previously is that there's never enough resources, right? So meeting the need of the ecosystem is fraught, right? Because even your largest funder is not going to have enough resources to equitably meet all the needs. And so some decisions have to be made, and some organizations need to be prioritized. But I definitely see and agree with your point, having put 2 children through college, and you know, you make just enough money that you don't qualify for assistance, and they assume that your contribution should be, you know, be that much more. And because you're just at that point, right, you don't get the full level of support that you need in assistance. So, you know, I definitely understand and respect where you're coming from, and I think it is important for, as funders, to be cognizant of that and to continue to hear that and consider that as we make decisions, because, you know, while, you know, yes, there are organizations that are teetering on the brink, and we try to meet those needs with emergency funding and to keep the doors open, but realizing that in order to have a fair and equitable pay and to, you know, we should be rewarding and training organizations to forecast appropriately, teach those skills, and reward those skills with support. So I think it's you know, I think in my opinion, you know, something that we as funders will continue to struggle with, because we need to make some of those difficult decisions, but also be mindful of how do we help to support organizations in making those healthy decisions about how to maintain and forecast appropriately and really build their organization for long-term sustainability.
I have a thought. Go ahead, Tracy, go ahead.
Thank you. So the Pivot Fund is a venture philanthropy. I like y'all. We don't have an endowment like y'all. I want one, but we don't have that. So, but we are venture philanthropy. That means we have to be highly strategic about how we invest our dollars. You know, Pivot Fund does not invest in need. We invest in opportunity. And I say that consistently. So I want to see organizations doing well. That encourages me to pay closer attention and encourages me to think that this may be a good place to invest our dollars. The Pivot Fund cannot afford, we can't afford, let me underscore that, we cannot afford to invest in organizations that are failing, right? All eyes are on the Pivot Fund. I can't go to major donors to get dollars if I'm investing in businesses that are failing. In other words, again, the Pivot Fund does not have $20 million to give to an organization to flop in less than 2 years. Pivot Fund would no longer be around if that was the case, right? So I want to be real, real clear that maybe some folks can afford to do that, to give money to organizations that fail, but Pivot Fund can't. And I don't think that is a rule in philanthropy. And I don't want you to think that either. I think anybody who has said that to you, that they want to give money to an organization that is on the brink, I think is not being honest with you.
Well, go ahead. Who has the microphone now? It's here. And
Is this working?
Gentleman right here that wants to, yeah. Yes, okay.
So, in super challenging times when it comes to funding and different streams being cut and just the uncertainty of it all, where does state government and local government, what's the relationship like with philanthropy? I know it's always very tricky, historically very tricky, where philanthropy begins, where government stops, all of the red tape. And so now more than ever, is there a need, a want, conversations happening to maybe like co-fund in a different kind of way or advocate for your grantees in a different kind of way as it relates to state and local, and not only when it comes to funding, I think just advocacy in general. And so what does that look like? And I know this is like a 3-part question, so just take it as you want. You brought up security, which I think is very, very critical. Even when it comes to the security and safety of your grantees and the communities in which you guys are stationed in. And so what does that look like with government and philanthropy for your individual organizations?
That's heavy. No apologies, because it needed to be asked. So who would like to tackle this?
So again, I'll start, and I think, at least for Lenfest, and, while you're one of our grantees through Every Voice, Every Vote, the majority of our grant making is to journalism organizations which aren't supported by the government or aren't supported by state funds. And so it's a little bit unique for us in particular, and some of our colleagues also are in that same position. So we don't kind of follow that model of kind of meeting the need where government ends, which some philanthropies that are supporting, a broader swath of nonprofit organizations might.
I think some journalism organizations have received government funding, right? And so, that's now in jeopardy if it's not already been eliminated. I am not one who, Pivot does not, we thought about it, but then all this other stuff started happening. I wanted to go engage in the broadband digital space and apply for dollars there, but we changed our minds as soon as this happened. And one of the questions that I wanted to ask the room is how many folks are for-profit versus how many folks are nonprofit in this room? Because I know a lot of folks were encouraged to become nonprofits, and now they're kind of nervous, real nervous right now, because of what's coming down from the federal government over and over again. Nonprofit, I've said to y'all before, is a tax status and not a business model. And so, but, I think that there are some nonprofit journalism organizations that have gotten government grants, and again, those grants are in jeopardy. In terms of security, I hope I heard your question right, but I think it's the funders will increasingly, they will be asked to support newsrooms around the security issue, not only keeping their staff safe when they're out covering stories, but also, just generally keeping staff safe and also self-care. I mean, they're under, again, these publishers who are on the front lines are under significant stress right now. And so I think funders will be asked to support the care of journalists and their newsrooms.
Can I say? Okay, so I'm not in the journalism space, but I have worked at nonprofits for 20 years, both at nonprofits that received state or federal funding and those that don't. So on your question about that, a lot of state governments are receiving pass-through grants from the state, from federal government, right? So their budgets are hurting and their ability to grant money is a real issue right now. What I would say is if you're interested in receiving both private and public monies, to be really careful, because when you start mixing them to support all aspects of your work, then that's where under the law, sort of all the restrictions that come with getting government money start applying to every aspect of your operations, and that's where you could get into trouble, or will really, really severely circumscribe what you can do, especially when it comes to like racial equity work. With regard to security, so, you know, I'm an employee of a nonprofit organization, and just last month, we had a sort of physical security training that included not just, you know, our building, but our offices, our equipment, all of that kind of thing. And then I think in a few weeks, we're gonna have a cybersecurity training because we're a civil rights organization. We're under the microscope of the, you know, because we're constantly speaking about the administration and what's happening. So, and that is being funded by, you know, private grant.
Any nonprofit newsrooms in this space right now, if you're getting government funding, make sure you open a separate bank account. Keep those dollars separate from your other revenue.
100%.
All right, final question, because we have to.
You go ahead, Jean. You go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you. Gene Son with Philadelphia Journalism Collaborative. You know, I had a short sigh of relief when the anti-nonprofit language got pulled from the large bill, but I'm assuming that will resurface later. What I'm more curious about is would that kind of language affect philanthropies, or is there some other thing that we could kind of expect to drop that would go after, just as we're seeing, you know, endowment taxes on universities and all sorts of anti-DEI in the education space? I'm wondering, is there an expectation that, you know, philanthropies will be a subsequent target, and what that mechanism might be?
They're already a target, right? We're already a target. Pivot Fund we're in the same district as the Fearless Fund. Trust me, they are watching. And I am fully aware. Should I be moving we might need to, you know, reorganize in Delaware, but right now we're in the same district. I mean, our lawyers have told us it's not a question of if, but when, right? I think that the larger philanthropy organizations, MacArthur, they are already working on these things, these issues, because they fully expect to be taxed, right? At exorbitant rates. And so, yeah, I think they are already in the crosshairs.
Yeah, I'll say a couple of things. So I think it was one of the day one or day two anti-DEI executive orders, there was this provision that talked about, you know, how in 120 days, Department of Justice had to come up with a list of, you know, the biggest businesses, or philanthropy with, I think, $500 million or more in assets, things like that. And so that 120 days has come and gone, so everyone's waiting to see who's on that list. I think the other thing, and I've told my own organization this, that we should be watching is just yesterday, the Senate confirmed the nominee to be the IRS commissioner. And the significance of that is that once there's a commissioner in place, they can start issuing guidance, changing the rules, changing process, everything that was governing, like nonprofit status, tax exempt status, what happens when they can initiate a review of your tax exempt status, all that could be about to change. They could be about to start ramping up reviews of nonprofits. You know, that's just something to watch out for.
Okay.
Maya, can you tell them what that means for people who might be nonprofits, just real quick? If you're a 501c3, that means your 501c3 is subject to be yanked, right? And that is one of the reasons some of us were fighting against moving all these newsrooms to become nonprofit entities. Am I wrong about this?
No, yeah, that's what's happening.
All right, it's 5:23.
On that
I know
depressing
this could
note.
go on for a little while, and I understand it, and I knew this was going to happen, right? So Nuala Cabral, Shawn Mooring, Tracy Powell, and Maya Ragu, thank you all so much for having this conversation with us this afternoon. I knew it was going to be a heavy one. All right, Shawn, what are we doing now? You ready?
Yeah, I'm ready.
All right, so we're going to wrap up and close this summit as they get off the stage. Whew, what a day. What do you think about what happened today? We only have a few minutes. What were some of the takeaways that you saw in this summit?
Well, I mean, so one of the things that I always really enjoy about the Reimagining journalism convening is that, journalism is a industry that is in a constant state of evolution, right? We're meeting immediate needs. We are addressing, how to best get news and information out to our constituents, and needing to think about, new technology. How do we sustain revenue? And so it's always engaging and important to me to really look at all aspects and to see what we can learn from some of our national partners. How can we highlight the amazing work that's happening here in Philadelphia, and what we can learn from one another, because one of the approaches that we take is that, the journalists that we work with, they are the experts, right? So we're not coming to impart, all of our knowledge and make everyone better, but how do we engage with folks? How do we learn from what they're doing out in communities every day? And what can we do to help facilitate making all of this better?
You had quite a plethora of panelists that were giving us information around pivoting, making sure that we learn how to do news differently, right? What are the influences in our pathway? We talked a little bit about AI, and I wish we could have done an entire day on AI alone.
Absolutely.
We didn't get into deep fake, how they're using AI to use them as journalists. It looks like a real scenario. People are sharing this information. But the thing that I noticed that many did not really talk about, Shawn, was the fear that they're feeling in their newsrooms. We discussed it at the end, but I am hearing it. People are talking. They don't cover certain news stories at all, and you see the shift in the way they're changing, where the news stories are being covered. What advice would you have for them now? Because this is a real thing for many journalists.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's real issues that need to be addressed. But I think, one of the stalwart points of journalism, right, is to be able to hold true and to speak, truth to power. It's been very interesting. So Lenfest has relationship with, an international organization that, will bring journalists from all over the country, and they'll come and they'll visit and we'll exchange ideas. And I think now, we can learn from them, right? From journalists in countries that have repressive governments and have attacked journalists. It's not something that we're used to or that we've had to deal with for, back when our president thinks America was great, and there was a repression and an attack on journalists. But now you have to understand how to navigate a hostile environment and what that means, and how we as funders can continue to support those organizations as they, go out and brave these streets.
As we wrap this thing up, what do you want to leave with these attendees? What is a follow-up for them, if any, through the Lenfest Foundation?
Lenfest Institute for Journalists, because we always get it confused.
Lenfest we do
Institute.
always, and I say it sometimes and I mix them up, but
That's all
Lenfest
right.
Institute, yeah.
I mean, for me, the biggest takeaway, one is this continued mantra around collaboration because we are stronger together than we are apart. I think that, continuing to be stalwart and true to what it is that your organization is formed to do. You're focused on informing your community and understanding, that that is not just the broader, community, but your neighborhood. So in each, one-to-one communication, who is it? How are you serving your community? How can you better and still ensure that your organization will be there for the long term, understanding how you're meeting the needs of your audience and what is it that you can do? How do you best utilize the tools that we've discussed? There is a fear of AI, right? But there's also a necessity to embrace it. And to look at how it can make your organization better. I'm always just in awe of what our grantees, our partners are, moving together to embrace into how they're looking to move forward and meet the current need. And so I would just, hope that there's something that you learned, a relationship that you've made, a connection that you've made that you can take away from this day. The model of success, right, is that this doesn't end at whatever time we finally get out of here,
Right.
but that there's something that you can take with you and that you can find to utilize and further empower your newsroom and help you reimagine what journalism should or could be.
There were a few people that were on the panels that I would love to interview and follow up with, right? And to continue to have the conversations. And I also noticed that there is this, and I guess when you've been in newsrooms, physical newsrooms for as long as you have, as we're talking about AI, one of the things we did not fully address is the fact that newsrooms as we know them are disappearing. People are choosing to cover the news in different ways, and newsrooms are letting their journalists go. The reporters are, and those reporters and journalists are starting their own thing, and they're moving to the platforms like YouTube, which is where they're all hanging out now. And it has become easier to manage your salaries or your contract work when you don't have to oversee the overhead of a newsroom and having to pay the rent and all those other things. Do you feel on some level that we understand that, or are we still in a space where this can't really happen to us? Or do you think we're embracing it more?
Well, I think the reality is, right, that this is happening. And I think we see across the industry where folks are looking at how do we meet this need? How do we survive? How do we continue to keep our doors open and serve our communities? And you're seeing where there's mid-course corrections that are being made. Folks are needing to do restructuring even in the midst of, where there was the kind of the political windfall, but, you still have to meet those overhead needs. You still are dealing with diminishing, ad dollars and navigating all of those things, the hybrid work environment and, realizing that you don't necessarily need a physical newsroom to address those needs. So I think we're in a constant state of, adjustment, recalibration, and we as funders need to continue to work closely and walk alongside to help folks meet those needs, but then also be cognizant of, to Tracy's point, right, we can't invest in a failing effort, right? So how do we help organizations become sustainable, but also, ensuring that they're making the necessary adjustments and continuing to meet those needs and take advantage of all of the opportunities that are out there.
My final question, and I have a ton of them. What do you do because news organizations are capitulating to what this current government is asking of them, and journalists are sometimes finding that these newsrooms are hostile environments for them. When you learn that as a funder, and that what and I'm not saying anybody in here is doing that, But if a grantee has created a hostile environment within their newsrooms because they are doing what the current government asks for them so that they can hold on to their funding, right? And it's a natural human thing to do. How do you address that, or don't you?
Well, I mean, so as a funding institution, we're not, I'm not here to tell you how to run your newsroom. We will definitely look and assess and, make a funding decision based on, what we see is fair, what is equitable, so we will make decisions and kind of, in the same way, kind of vote with your feet, right? If there's something that's not acceptable in your side, I'm not going to tell you to change, right? But we may not continue to work together, continue to partner, but it's not. I don't see it my place to come in and dictate to a newsroom. If they make a decision that doesn't sit well, or we don't no longer feel is equitable and fair to their employees, it may not be a relationship that we continue to move forward with.
Thank you for that transparency. I appreciate it. I had a great time being your mistress of ceremonies again. This was good. I thought that people were incredibly engaged throughout the day, that we had some honest and thought-provoking conversations, and I believe people are going to walk away from here with so much more than they thought they were going to come in and get. So thank you. Thank you to you and the Lenfest Institute. Where did he leave? Jim left? Jim, and for those of you who stuck it out to the bitter end, because this was necessary, it is needed, and as you navigate through these next months, I can't even go into years, as these next days, weeks, and months, you're going to find where the rubber meets the road for so many of you, and you get to decide whether you want to continue doing this or not. Journalism as we know it is shifting, and we have to shift with it. Thank you all so much. Thank you, Shawn.
Thank you.